Hello everybody, and welcome to Drydock episode 106. This week's questions are taken from the video on HMS Thunderchild, back from the 1st of April, as well as Guide 173, the extended guide to the fantastic USS England. So let's get on with questions. James DJ asks, have there ever been any battles between hugely mismatched opponents, for example, Age of Sail ships versus pre-dreadnoughts? Well, yes, there have been quite a few, but they don't necessarily always go the way you think. I mean, pictured, obviously, one of the easiest examples, the iron gunboat, or small corvette, depending on how you want to classify it, Nemesis versus Chinese war junks. So you're talking about the latest and greatest of early to mid 19th century technology versus, to be perfectly honest, a ship design and armament type that hadn't really changed all that much since the late medieval period, and that ended about as you'd expect. You've also, to a lesser extent, got several cases during World War II when, during the invasions of various countries or colonies, you had modern top-of-the-line military units coming up against what were effectively relics from World War I or shortly before. That's not such a massive difference in time, but technology-wise it might as well have been. And even within the given time period and technology level, there are still massively unequal fights, such as the French frigate at the Battle of the Nile that inexplicably tried to pick a fight with a ship of the line when there was an entire convention in place at the time that ships of the line didn't fire at frigates unless fired upon first, specifically because 99.9% of frigate captains knew that fighting ship of the line was a one-way ticket to losing your ship, and unsurprisingly, the frigate got blown to bits within a matter of minutes by the slightly ticked-off ship of the line, who was effectively just going, look, I'm trying to actually fight a battle over here, please go away, and then made them go away. Now, as beyond that, there is also the fact that just because something is old doesn't necessarily mean that it's without teeth. You've got to remember the Battle of Lissa, SMS Kaiser, even though it's a wooden ship of the line and therefore on paper massively outclassed by the various Italian ironclads, comes out of that particular battle ahead, albeit minus a bow. And you've got other incidents, although it's not entirely ship to ship, you've got things like the Oscarborg fortress in Oslo, near Oslo, when the Germans came calling in the Norwegian campaign, because at that point you had a fortress that, theoretically, completely obsolete. It was basically a pre-dreadnought era fortress versus a top-of-the-line heavy cruiser, but with the element of surprise, it turns out the fortress still had quite a bit of bite to it. And then if you're looking, again, within the same era of technology, but a theoretically very unequal fight, you have things like the last stand of HMS Revenge, which, again, on paper, that battle should have been over in 10 minutes, but it took a lot longer and took a lot more Spanish ships with it than you would otherwise have thought. Voda Darius asks, could a dynamite cruiser concept have been effective in World War I or World War II if all the problems with it had been ironed out? Unfortunately, amusing as the concept is, I don't really think it would be practical in World War I or World War II. And that's mainly because when you look at the problems that the dynamite cruiser had, they don't actually address the issues that would have come up with the use in those later periods. The main problem that the dynamite cruisers had was that, well, the dynamite cruiser, USS Vesuvius, was somewhat difficult to calculate the range using the pressure built up in the gun, because that depended on all sorts of atmospheric conditions as well as exactly how much pressure you were putting into the chambers, which of course led to accuracy issues. Now, that's one thing. That's the main problem, because if you can't hit something because you're firing all sorts of weird and wonderful ranges, it doesn't really matter about anything else. But separately to that was another problem, which was lack of range and lack of rate of fire. Now, the rate of fire issue is something of a problem. Potentially, that could have been cured by having multiple chambers in some kind of switching mechanism that allowed you to move the pressure feed between them, although that would have been very complicated, but could have been done. The main problem, though, when it comes to World War I and World War II, is something that wasn't really the case when the Vesuvius was commissioned, and that's range. Because back when it was commissioned, well, the fact that the pneumatic cannon could only, quote-unquote, shoot a few kilometres wasn't a massive problem, because no one else could really either. I mean, the guns could theoretically throw their shells further than that, but they'd never hit anything, because centralised fire control and rangefinders hadn't been installed, so it was all much of a muchness. But by the time of World War One, when you've got centralised director firing, all sorts of fancy rangefinders and plotting tables, etc., now all of a sudden much longer barrelled guns are able to shoot shells miles, if not over 10 miles. I wouldn't say tens of miles, because that implies over 20 miles, which, again, theoretically within the capabilities of physically doing so, but not within the accuracy capabilities of a World War One ship, but whatever. But a dynamite cruiser's pneumatic guns were never going to match that kind of range. So even a small ship like Vesuvius, armed with a theoretically massive punch, would have been shot to pieces by practically anything down to the size of destroyer guns long before it got into range of anything. About the only real scenario where I can see this kind of firepower being somewhat useful would maybe be some kind of niche case aboard a merchant raider, like the various ones that the Germans like to come up with. Not that you'd want to use it in combat with an actual warship, unless you manage to get a real drop on something like Cormoran versus Sydney. But when you're talking about going after merchant shipping, the fact that you can fit a theoretically massive punch into what's otherwise a relatively short-range weapon probably would have some utility, because it would mean that you'd have the ability to either really clobber a merchant ship that was refusing to heave to, or else put a merchant ship down fairly quickly using what are, relatively speaking, low volume bits of ammunition, because the only other alternative is to expend vast amounts of 5.96 inch whatever ammunition to try and sink a merchant ship, or a big heavy torpedo, or go on board and scuttle the ship manually, all of which either take time or use up a lot of high volume ammunition. So yeah, maybe a single large pneumatic cannon built in specifically to a merchant raider might have some utility in helping to both secure and finish off merchant shipping, but it would be a very niche use. Josh Thomas Moore asks, what would you name the other two ships of your Thunderchild class? Well, trying to keep a theme going, but also drawing on, admittedly at the time, not quite Royal Navy traditional names, because they came a little bit afterwards, but still, in keeping, obviously, with the choices the Royal Navy would eventually make, I would probably go with Stormcloud and Tempest. Taco Cat asks, how viable is a modern escort carrier such as a modern USS Guadalcanal type carrier? So for reference, USS Guadalcanal was a Casablanca-class escort carrier, as seen here. Now, there's a number of interesting ways that you could go about determining what exactly would be a modern escort carrier. Do you go with something that's directly comparable, i.e. 8 to 10,000 tons size, but that runs into problems that modern aircraft have increased greatly in size and complexity, and to be perfectly honest, the speed of a Casablanca class is probably not something you want to replicate these days. So that, I think, is probably not the viable route to go down. You can look at relative dimensions, length, etc. compared to fleet carriers, but again, aircraft capabilities being what they are, as well as the invention of the angled flight deck, does make all of that somewhat of a sticky minefield to walk through. But I think actually one of the better ways of doing it would be to look at relative displacement to determine what you'd be looking at for a modern escort carrier. So if we're talking about the US Navy, because let's face it, no one else is going to be building escort carriers for fleet carriers anytime soon, the Ford class is supposedly around about 100,000 tons fully loaded. Now, the fully loaded weights of the Casablanca and Essex class, so escort carrier and fleet carrier, when you compare them, give you a ratio of, well, roughly between 3.75 and 4 to 1, depending on if you're using standard loading, fully loaded, whatever. So in that kind of region. So what happens if you divide through the 100,000 tons of the Ford by a fraction under 4? Well, you end up with something in the high 20,000 ton range, so 27,000 ton. So are there any carrier deck hulls that are around at the moment that come in at around 28,000 tons fully loaded, maybe a little bit less? Yes, there are. But a fair amount of them, to be perfectly honest, are LHDs and other such amphibious vessels, so they're hybrids, not exactly what you'd take as an escort carrier, because they have other roles. But there is one vessel that pops in at almost exactly that kind of displacement, fully loaded, and is very definitely designed from the start for aviation operations. And that would be the Japanese Izumo class. Honestly, Gov, they're helicopter carriers, Gov, or helicopter destroyers even. They're definitely not aircraft carriers. Completely ignore the fact that we designed the lifts almost exactly to match the dimensions of the F-35B, and when we put heat-resistant paint on there, almost as if we were expecting jet operations. And no, they're not. And ignore the fact we named the second one Karga as well. Please ignore that. Then recently announced they're actually going to convert it for F-35B use anyway, so, well, so much for that masquerade. But yes, witness pretty much the modern definition of an escort carrier, at least in relation to something like a Nimitz or a Ford. So, as for viability, well, they exist. Rough air group, probably a squadron of F-35Bs and some ASW helicopters, so yeah, not bringing a massive amount of strike potential to a proper carrier fight, but then again, how many proper carrier fights are there likely to be? In terms of something like convoy escort or handling a mixture of last-minute air defense and anti-submarine operations to escort, say, an amphibious task group, thus allowing the big carriers to run around a bit more freely rather than being tied to slow amphibs, they probably make a certain amount of sense, but you've got to find someone who's willing to build them en masse for them to truly become escort carriers, rather than just, we sneak to this one under the radar, it just happens to be the size of a modern escort carrier kind of thing. But yeah, it's potentially viable if the money's there. Hellspiker asks, could a normal built ship of 8,000 tons even survive ramming something at 20 knots? How do you think internals would have been built on Thunderchild so as not to have engines etc. join the torpedo room at the first ram? A normal built ship would have some more issues, but even then, it's more about application of force over area than anything else. Bearing in mind, when you're talking about any kind of ship that weighs in the sort of 4 to 5 digit displacement range in terms of tonnage and is moving at any appreciable speed, the fact that your target and you happen to be made out of largely sheet iron or sheet steel is not that relevant as far as you might think, because the sheer amount of kinetic energy present in even something as relatively speaking small as an 8,000 ton ship moving at 20 knots it's so huge that when that is concentrated over an area like the bow of a ship, the plating and most of the structural members of a ship that it rams effectively, well, they'll provide resistance obviously, but they're not going to stop the thing cold at all. I mean, okay, so it was built for ramming, but here is the bow of HMS Camperdown, of the Camperdown Victoria collision incident, and you can see, yes, there was some damage just above the ram as a result of that particular incident, but overall, the ship is pretty much intact. I mean, yes, obviously it needed repairs, and that hole would have let flooding in, but relatively speaking, it's not a massive deal, especially compared to what happened to poor old Victoria. I mean, one of the things you've got to bear in mind is that most ships, and especially warships, are built with all sorts of weird and wonderful shocks and acceleration and deceleration events already baked into the design. So when you're in a ship that's being chucked around in a North Atlantic or a Pacific storm, there's an awful lot of movement in direction that you don't really want your ship to be moving in, and there's also an awful lot of slamming. And again, with the amount of kinetic energy involved, if you happen to be sailing along at 20 knots and you run bow first into a monster storm wave, effectively you're probably going to be experiencing a similar magnitude of a kinetic energy event in terms of slowing you down as the initial stages of ramming an actual ship. So to a certain degree, a lot of the heavier stuff is already bolted down hard enough to account for that. But with ships that were designed specifically to ram, there was obviously extra strengthened bow plating, extra strengthened bow structural members, and a lot of internal bulkheads, and the removal of anything potentially massively explosive, apart from the occasional torpedo, from the bow of the ship in question. And the torpedoes tended to be housed in the area immediately behind and on a level with the ram itself, and the ram, obviously being the strongest part, is far less likely to distort. So yeah, you'd survive quite easily the ram itself. Whether or not you can control the flooding afterwards would depend on the build of your bow and how prepared you were. Because, again, I mean, it's one of those hypotheticals that people occasionally come up with. If Titanic had rammed the iceberg instead of trying to evade it and scraping alongside the side, there's a reasonable odds chance it might actually have survived, or at the very least it would have survived a lot longer. Yes, there would have been a bunch of injuries from people being thrown off their feet, but it most likely would have stayed afloat long enough for other ships to arrive to take off a lot more survivors than historically occurred. So large ships are generally speaking fairly tough if they're built properly. John 750T asks, you've mentioned in various videos ships that were in desperate need of overhaul but still being pressed into service, Hood being a glaring example. I'm curious as to what actually in ships' power plants and other systems is wearing out, causing the need for the work. And to that end, are ships designed to last a certain time between refits? Well, when we're looking at things like steam turbine power plants specifically, there are a huge number of factors that can go into degrading the power plant's overall effectiveness. Back in World War I, one of the more egregious ones was actually the quality of coal and how intensely you were using that. Now, that could actually degrade your power plant very quickly, to the point that, again, for using the Battle of Jutland as an example, because it's a source of so many good examples, both good and bad, for military shipping at the time, a number of the German ships, especially things like destroyers, actually, by the night period, were only capable of about 16 to 18 knots, because their power plants have been choked with clinker and ash. Now, fair enough, you could clear that, but that was in large part because of using poor quality coal. Now, that has a knock-on effect, because not only is there loads of clinker and ash blocking up your grates and reducing the overall power output of your boilers, which is a problem, but that kind of coal also produces all sorts of interesting and rather nasty gases and fumes, which, when they're heated up in, well, a boiler, also will start to rapidly degrade the actual materials of the boiler itself. So it's not just a case of having to slow down, clear everything out and re-stoke the fires again. It's also a case of you've actually taken probably several months, if not maybe a couple of years, off of the lifespan of that boiler if you run it that hard for that long with poor quality fuel. There is a certain amount of that can happen with poor quality oil as well, but it's slightly less pronounced immediately than it can be with coal, because it, well, isn't going to produce quite as much clogging, although it can do. But long term, actually, poor quality oil can do a lot more damage, precisely because you don't have the kind of, well, our engines have stopped working after 24 hours kind of scenario, which means you might keep running on poor quality oil until something goes bang, which can be bad. But the other thing to take into account with the turbine side of things, as opposed to the boiler side of things, is that, well, water is not a friendly substance. It is actually quite corrosive, and when you heat it up and turn it into steam, it becomes even more corrosive, and that's without having lots of different trace chemicals and elements in there, which usually there would be, because let's face it, you're not going to get 100% deionized pure water used in the turbines. I mean, using seawater could be done. It was known to really badly stuff the engines up very, very quickly, mostly because of all the other chemicals that were in it, salt being one of them. But still, blowing high pressure steam at something will degrade it over time regardless, especially when it's metal. So there's basic chemical reactions going on there that will eventually wear things out. And of course, no system is frictionless, so even if you've got things like greased bearings and such, like, you are eventually going to be wearing those bearing runs and the bearings themselves out. You can replace them and such like, but you're still wearing the overall system down. And eventually something will break, usually a turbine blade, and then things go horribly wrong, unless of course you pull the ship in for overhaul well before that. Now, that's not an exhaustive list, not by a long shot. I know there are a few people who watch these videos on the channel who have served in various engineering departments in various navies and on board merchant ships, and they will be more than qualified to list the massive number of things that can horribly degrade the efficiency and lifespan of your engine. After all, we only have a few minutes in answering a dry dock question. But as a broad rule of thumb, it would seem that, at least for capital ships, most of their engines and overall power plants were designed for roughly 2 decades of what you would term not entirely peacetime steaming, but normal steaming. So after a couple of decades, things would start to be running down. You'd obviously do little minor overhauls and such like in between, but after a couple of decades, it was basically replace the engines or lose them. And this is, amongst other reasons, why the Congos were completely re-engined. They'd kind of reached, by the mid-1930s, the end of their engines' operational lifespans anyway. This is also why, for example, HMS Hood was in such a bad way, because it was pushing beyond the envelope. It was sort of just over 20 years since it had had its engines installed. And yeah, they were degrading, and it had run through, at that point, 1.5-ish of combat steaming. And combat steaming is obviously a lot more intense, a lot more destructive on the materials of the engines, and it was undergoing all this combat steaming right at the end of its engine's lifespan, which is just going to degrade the engines a lot faster than if it had been running through that combat steaming period when its engines were fresh. And it's also, as I covered in one of the other dry docks, one of the many reasons why it's very unlikely the Iowas will be ever recommissioned, because with their kind of stop-start service going into and out of reserves, their power plant has roughly seen about 20 years, give or take, depending on the ship, of general steaming. So their engines are pretty much at the end of their operational career anyway, even assuming that they haven't completely frozen in place due to inactivity over the past decade. Josh Thomas Moore asks, in the Battle of the Java Sea, which nation on the Allied side had the best force in the fleet? It's a bit of a difficult one, actually, because when you look at numerically, the Americans have the largest force. They have 6 vessels present, then the Dutch with 5, then the Royal Navy with 4, and then the Australians with 1. But then you look into exactly what kind of ships you've got present, and the whole thing changes around again. Because if you're looking at the most modern, well, actually the Australian Navy has the most modern force present, even though they've only got 1 ship, HMAS Perth, because Perth is the most modern ship present in the, well, not capital ships, in the cruiser force. Java, De Ruyter, Exeter and Houston are all much older than it is, and with no other ships there to kind of drag the average down, theoretically the Australian Navy has the most modern force. Then if you're looking just at the large ships, the Dutch have the largest number of cruisers. They've got 2, everybody else only has 1 present, but both of the Dutch ships are light cruisers, and they're also some of the oldest vessels present, so swings and roundabouts on that one. And then when you look at firepower, theoretically USS Houston has the greatest amount of firepower, being a Northampton-class heavy cruiser, but then that's somewhat offset by the fact that the relatively numerous numbers of destroyers that are present with it are pretty old. If you look at it purely on paper, in theory, the British force that's present is actually probably, on balance, the most powerful. Exeter is, okay, it's not the world's greatest heavy cruiser, but it is still a heavy cruiser of sorts. It's just been refitted between its encounter with Graf Spee and this incident with modern radar for the period, albeit that, weirdly enough, its gunnery actually got worse after it was fitted with the radar as compared to before, so swings and roundabouts there, but I say this is on paper only. And it's certainly got more firepower than Java, De Ruyter or Perth. Basically, the only thing that has more firepower than it is Houston. And then when you take the whole force in balance, you look at the destroyers. As we said, yes, the Americans have 5 destroyers, the British have 3, but the American ones are all fairly old Clemsons, and the British destroyers, Electra and Encounter, are E-class from the 1930s. They're not the world's biggest and best destroyers, but they're certainly a step above the Clemsons. And then you've got Jupiter, which is actually a very capable vessel, and unfortunately then runs into a mine. So yeah, on paper, the British destroyer force is actually pretty good. So yeah, paper-wise, say the Royal Navy actually brought the biggest punch to the party as a collective amount, but didn't do them all that much good, as say with Exeter somehow mysteriously developing the inability to hit anything, the most powerful destroyer in the entire fleet running into a mine, and everything else just going horribly wrong, as it did at the Battle of the Java Sea. Glenn Ricafrente asks, what did USS England do that other ships didn't? Was the crew really that good, or just really, really lucky? Now, for this, I have to actually thank one of the channel's viewers who sent a very nice email and article based on a fair amount of research that he'd done in the immediate aftermath of the USS England video being published. And he brought to my attention the fact that the executive officer aboard USS England was one Lieutenant Commander John A. Williamson from Birmingham, Alabama. And this guy was something of a mathematical genius. He'd graduated high school early, he'd managed to get a degree in mathematics, all before the young age of 23, and then found himself, during the war, working on destroyers in the North Atlantic, where he proved to be so good at his job that he was taken out of the destroyers and sent to the sub-chasing school as an instructor. So, yeah, he was still relatively young, but he had been chosen specifically out of all the men in the US Navy as the guy who would teach everybody else how to hunt submarines using sonar. He was then given his commission of Lieutenant Commander and sent off to be the executive officer of USS England. And, well, because, of course, if you are the one of the chief instructors at the submarine sonar school, you take your best and brightest with you. He took one of his absolute very best students with him to be the chief sonar operator on USS England. So not only did you have literally the guy who was pretty much writing the book on how to hunt submarines using sonar aboard the ship, you had his best sonar operating student running the sonar, at which point, is it any surprise that Japanese submarines suddenly started dropping like flies? I don't think so. So there you go, everybody. The main lesson from this particular little tale is learn your mathematics, because if you do, you might be able to go out and kill lots of submarines with it. I have a feeling the recruitment levels at mathematics degree courses in universities would probably increase significantly if they used a tagline along those kind of thoughts. Craig Hagenbruch asks, could depth charges sink or damage ships as well? Yes, they certainly could, and indeed one of the conundrums of depth charge use, especially early on, was figuring out exactly how to, well, chuck a massive bunch of explosives off the back of a ship without said explosion also taking out the stern of the ship when it went off. Now, obviously, this would depend on the size of the depth charge, how quickly it sank, at what depth you had it set to detonate, etc. But yeah, if it went wrong, you could badly damage the launching ship with a depth charge that maybe went off too shallowly, or if it was particularly big, just went off at all in the vicinity. You've also got to account for things like when HMS Punjabi was rammed and sunk by accident by King George V, the detonation of her depth charges underwater not only killed, unfortunately, a lot of the crew who was in the water, but also caused some small amount of damage to USS Washington, which had been following on. Now, that was a lot of depth charges going off, but not directly underneath the Washington, but still in the vicinity. So yeah, in theory, if you could get a depth charge to go off close enough to a ship, it would cause a lot of damage. Potentially even sinking it. The main problem would actually be how you'd do that, because a depth charge that would be more effective against a ship would be one set to detonate at a relatively shallow depth, as opposed to when you're going after submarines, when you tend to set that detonation depth to a little bit further down, and you've also got to get the thing into position so that the ship is going to be effectively running over it when it goes off, which is somewhat difficult. I mean, when you're talking about ships, basically the only way you're going to do that would be to set your depth charges for relatively shallow detonation and somehow find yourself pretty much directly ahead of an enemy ship at very close range, which is usually a very bad place to be in. Drop your depth charge and then hope it goes off underneath them. So very much a tactic of last-ditch desperation. Perhaps more viably would be dropping them via aircraft, which was done especially in the Second World War. But at that point, effectively, it's basically like bombing, but you've got to, again, somehow know that you're going after a ship in time enough to set your fuse to a relatively shallow depth, again, to cause maximum damage. Apparition 13 asks, USS England versus HMS Starling, the single patrol anti-submarine record holder versus the career anti-submarine record holder. Which achievement do you rate more highly? And relatedly, if you're a submarine captain, which would you rather face? To be honest, it's difficult to rate the two achievements against each other, because whilst they are both in the field of World War II anti-submarine warfare, they are very, very different. USS England, as we covered, had a superb crew, and to be honest, superb luck, in as much as the Japanese had this wonderful line of submarines that they could roll up. Starling, on the other hand, also had a superb crew, superb commanding officer, but was working in a very different environment in the Atlantic, where there's a lot more individual submarine contacts to prosecute, but the overall theatre, if you like, is much, much larger. So it racking up more kills over a longer period of time. On the surface, more kills is more impressive, but on the other hand, with England, getting them all at once is very impressive. And then you've kind of got the argument of, well, if you switch the scenarios, how well would they do? Well, Starling is fractionally slower, but it has a very competent group working with it. England, if you put it in the Atlantic, it's still got its brilliant sonar man and XO, captain for that matter. But on the other hand, it's not going to really run into long lines of U-boats strung out waiting for the pickings. So how would they do in each other's environments? It's, apart from well, it's difficult to tell. So I don't think really that I'd like to call it between the two as the more impressive, because they're both incredibly impressive in their own way. However, if I was a submarine captain, I would be more reticent about facing the Starling by a small amount. And the reason for that is not so much about the ships themselves. I mean, obviously, as a U-boat captain, I'm very unlikely, or Japanese submarine captain, I'm very unlikely to know exactly which ship is coming after me anyway. But if somehow magically I did, being hunted by either HMS Starling or USS England would be an absolutely terrifying prospect. The sole pretty much reason I would go with Starling being worse as an experience for a submarine captain is that, as I say, Starling operated with a very, very competent hunter-killer group, second support group, for a lot of its career, and would also periodically operate with things like escort carriers and such. So with USS England, given that, as we saw, occasionally England would come to the rescue of other ships in its group that were trying for several hours to take out a submarine captain and failing, with England you've only got one lethal killer to worry about, and potentially you could get attacked by the rest of its group, but probably a lot less of a concern. Whereas with Starling, you've got a very lethal killer to worry about, and a bunch of only marginally less worrying killers to worry about, plus aircraft, if it's the wrong time of year, all coming after you. So just the multiplicity of threats, I would probably be slightly more scared about going up against Starling. Robot 1435 asks, why were some anti-aircraft guns mounted on the main batteries of some warships? And we can see what's being referred to here with a couple of anti-aircraft positions on B turret of HMS Queen Elizabeth. So the reason for this is, well, there's two really. One is available real estate for the installation of anti-aircraft weaponry, particularly light anti-aircraft weaponry with open mounts, was at a premium on almost all ships by the mid to late World War II period, when they basically wanted to put a gun anywhere they could possibly fit one. And especially on the older refits, but even some of the newer ones, when you've got your heavy AA, which usually is also your secondary battery down the side, you can't put light AA or medium AA too close to that because of blast effects. Likewise, unless your ship is really long, like the Iowas, you can't generally put light or medium AA, so 20 or 40 millimeter, on the bow or stern of your ship, because it'll be subject to some very nasty blast effects from your main battery, if it happens to be firing in that general direction. As I say, exceptions did exist. So, outside of mounting them on various interesting bits of the superstructure, the large flat turret roofs are actually one of the few remaining pieces of unused space that you can actually put AA guns on. Now, obviously, generally speaking, they weren't going to put AA guns on the lower turret of a super firing pair because, well, that's one easy way to basically lose your entire turret-mounted AA battery the first time your main guns need to be shot. But on the top of the upper turret, the super firing turret, it was actually relatively speaking safe. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily want to be on there when the guns were firing, but the amount of overpressure wouldn't be enough to seriously damage the actual anti-aircraft guns themselves, and you could then come back to them. The other factor is that it's actually one of the better spots when the main guns aren't firing, because if you think about it, with your AA, what do you need? You need relatively high elevation so that you can, or above the water so you can see a fair distance. You want a fairly nice wide field of fire, and you also want to be relatively stable. It was one of the minor problems with having AA on the bow or stern is the fact that that's the area where there's going to be the greatest movement from the ship pitching. Being on top of a super firing main gun turret, you're actually, well, you're pretty much near enough as makes no difference on the centre line of the ship, and you're actually fairly close to a midship, so the amount of movement, vertical move and horizontal movement that's going on is actually relatively small. Obviously, there's if the ship pitches or rolls, it's going to roll to the same amount. The degree of a change in terms of angle is going to be the same across the ship, but the actual physical movement linearly is going to be a lot less. So it makes it a lot easier for your mount to be stable, and you've got a pretty nice field of fire. I mean, if you look at those two mounts, obviously they don't have complete fields of fire because they're right next to each other, but each of those mounts has probably around about 270 degree arc of fire if they're aiming high, and at least a 180 to 200 degree arc of fire if they're having to aim at something low level like a torpedo bomber or a low level kamikaze. And compared to almost anywhere else that you can put AA on the ship, that's actually a fantastic amount of space. And it covers a broad range of the ship, so because from that position you can fire not quite straight back, but almost. So you can cover the entire flank of the ship, and you can cover the bow of the ship, whereas a gun position almost anywhere else is actually going to be able to cover a lot less, unless you maybe stick it on top of the bridge superstructure or something. But then you've got to worry about taking out radar antenna and such like. So yeah, there's some good reasons for doing so, but it does have that one restriction of if you're in a big gun duel, you probably don't want to be there. But then again, outside of the covered, fully enclosed mounts, you probably didn't want to be anywhere outside on deck at all during a big gun duel. So it's a relatively minor drawback. And now for some Patreon questions. Matthew Jones asks, it appears that there are 3 areas where Royal Navy destroyers in mid-war and World War II period seem to lag behind their USN counterparts: use of welding, longitudinal framing, and high-pressure machinery. Was it just the stubbornness of UK shipbuilding industries, or were there other reasons that Royal Navy destroyers seemed to fall behind? So there are different reasons for each. When it comes to welding, there was a certain amount of welding used in Royal Navy ships in the interwar period and into World War II, but it was less widespread and less common than in US ships. Now, partly that was down to some early experiments gone wrong, and partly down to inertia. And I'll explain the two things. Riveting, generally speaking, for this period, gave slightly stronger results, but welding was obviously faster and resulted in a lot of weight savings. So, I mean, for example, welding was used relatively extensively in things like the Leander class cruisers, and they're built in the early 1930s. So welding wasn't an unknown technology to the Royal Navy, but bearing in mind that their destroyers were having to survive being thrown around the North Atlantic and the North Sea an awful lot, on balance, the Royal Navy would prefer to have a slightly heavier but slightly stronger destroyer versus a slightly lighter destroyer, but one that might crack or snap a little bit more often, which is obviously bad. Now, that's in part due to the nature of welding, but also in part due to the fact that despite British shipbuilders having some degree of experience with it, as well as American shipbuilders, it was still an emerging technology. We know, for example, that when welding was done badly, various Liberty ships did develop cracks quite quickly. And so it's a bit of a trade-off, really. There's also the fact, which is where it comes to tradition, a lot of Royal Navy Royal Yards, as well as general dockyards in the UK, had been established for a very long time, so they got very, very good at riveting. They knew how to do it well, and everyone had the skills and expertise. To retrain in welding would require time to stop work, take those skilled workers offline, retrain them in how to use welding, which, as I said, may or may not be the preferred choice at that point. And in the 1930s and World War II, when the Royal Navy was basically either desperately preparing for or desperately fighting a war, the idea of, well, we'll stop work on half a dozen or more warships for 6 months or so while we retrain our entire workforce in this new skill didn't really appeal to them that much. Now, the flip side is that with the US, although the US did have a relatively decent shipbuilding industry pre-World War I, the amount of money and the amount of orders that had been received both from overseas and from the US Navy, once Congress actually decided to give them more than 3 dimes and a nickel, in the middle of World War I and thereafter, meant that US shipyards had actually seen a massive expansion in size and capability in the 1910s and 1920s. Now, that meant that they were starting out pretty much fresh. So they could, whilst the shipyards were being developed, expanded, etc., train up a lot more of their brand new workforce in these brand new techniques, as opposed to British shipyards, which, as they had this sort of ongoing issue of not being able to shut down production for very long. And yet there was a certain amount of tradition involved as well. So that's the welding part. High pressure machinery was something that US actually got very, very good at very quickly. And this, to be perfectly honest, is just an example of a small amount of trade-off, but also a fairly large amount of, well, some technologies are just invented or perfected to a certain degree in some countries before others. It's simple as that. The Royal Navy was aware of high-pressure machinery, but its own efforts with high-pressure machinery had mixed success. Some types of high-pressure machinery that had been tried had similar levels of reliability to what would eventually turn out to be the German ultra-high-pressure machinery. And on balance, the Royal Navy was looking at it and sort of going, well, we can get locally sourced high-pressure engine trains, but they're less reliable than the lower pressure ones, and being that they had an empire to worry about, which meant lots of long-distance sailing and potentially ships being a long way away from any kind of major help, which you would need in the event of a massive engineering casualty, they preferred to go with lower pressure but somewhat more reliable machinery as compared to the higher pressure but slightly less reliable machinery. And to be honest, the US, to a lesser degree, but I mean they still had the Pacific to worry about, but to a lesser degree was in the same kind of boat, but various US companies managed to crack the idea of reliable high pressure machinery a few years ahead of British ones, and so they had the advantage of actually being able to use high pressure and high reliability machinery sooner than the Royal Navy could. And by the time British companies had made those kinds of advances themselves, and this is a story you'll hear an awful lot in the 1930s, by the time a British company was able to do X, war had started, and everyone was just like, yeah, when in the middle of a war, we need to build everything as quickly as possible. Anything that extends build time by even a fraction because it's new, we don't want. We just want to churn out as much stuff as humanly possible, as quickly as possible. That applied to varying degrees in varying armed services, but in the Navy, when the delays would be in terms of months rather than days, which it might be for a fighter or something, it was very definitely a case of, well, we'd actually prefer to have that destroyer or whatever for a few more months rather than have it be slightly faster. Framing and general layout issues in destroyers, that, to be honest, is more a case of relative size. The US Navy, generally speaking, built right up to the treaty limits when it came to destroyers. They built the heavier flotilla leaders, which made up a smaller portion of their allocated tonnage, and everything else kind of tried to build up to that size. Whereas when you look at the Royal Navy, pretty much the same for the same reasons that you ended up with the Leander class and Arethusa class light cruisers and the York class heavy cruisers, the Royal Navy was trying to get as many hulls for an allocated amount of tonnage as possible. So you look at the pre-tribal class destroyers, they're usually 200 to 300 tons lighter than a lot of other nations' destroyers because they're not actually building up to the maximum size limit that's allocated by the treaty, on the view that, well, if you build a 1,300-ish ton destroyer, then for every 4 or 5 destroyers at that size that you build, you can get another hull, compared to someone who's building up to sort of 1,500 or so tons. Not obviously accounting for the heavier displacements for the flotilla leaders and such. And with a smaller ship, well, design practices and how you build the hull, how you lay out the machinery, etc., it's all subject to very different considerations. And you might think, oh, it's only 200-300 tons here or there. What difference does it make? Well, maybe on a battleship, the difference between 35,000 and 35,300 tons might not be all that much. I mean, a naval architect will still scream about it, but in the grand scale of things, it's an addressable issue. Whereas when you're talking at the scale of destroyers, that's like, well, if you're going with the lower end of sort of the 1,200-1,300 ton destroyer, a 300-ton displacement difference is 25% of your total displacement. So on battleship scale terms, that's kind of like the equivalent of about an 8,000 to 9,000 ton displacement difference, which ironically enough is just a fraction over the displacement difference between Bismarck and an actual treaty battleship. It's around about the displacement difference between Tirpitz and an actual treaty battleship. So yeah, very, very different at that point in terms of overall scale. But to be fair, the whole longitudinal framing and ship design issue is probably something that needs a lot deeper of a look in a video at some point. Nickboy302 asks, during my read of Collins of the Sydney, the author notes in relation to Royal Navy and Royal Australian Navy and Australian and British armies, there was nothing remarkable about an Australian naval officer being given command in a British force. It is unlikely this would have occurred quite so freely in the army. Why was this the case? Part of it would have just been sheer size. I mean, the Australian army pre-war was relatively small, and a lot of its officers, its higher ranking officers, had been in place for a fair amount of time, whereas the British Army was considerably larger and obviously grew a lot quicker, and I'll to a much greater size. So the odds of there being a relatively senior Australian land commander, especially in the early to mid-war period, who had relevant combat experience, would be fairly slim, and on land there is a much more stratified and hierarchical command structure. So an army that goes out, or even a division that goes out, there's going to be a general or a major general or something like that somewhere in the vicinity, and everything cascades down. So if the Australian army is making a, relatively speaking in terms of overall numbers, small contribution, the chances are that there's going to be a lot more senior British officers around. And obviously, since they're A, senior, and B, they have had previous command of the majority of the troops that are present, it's very likely that they're going to take command. Now, the exact details and intricacies are probably best served by someone who knows a lot more about the land side of things than myself. But when it comes to the naval side of things, there was much more interchangeability. And the reason for that was that whilst the Australian Army did do cooperation and with the British Army in the peacetime, and they did use British equipment, the Royal Australian Navy was using, in a lot of cases, pretty much almost exactly the same ships. They were using Leander-class cruisers, County-class heavy cruisers, and so on and so on. This particular ship is Brisbane, slightly older cruiser, but nevertheless. So they're either using the same ships or variations on the same ships. There's an awful lot more cooperation between the Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy in the interwar period as compared to the British Army and the Royal Australian Army, mainly because, to be perfectly honest, ships can go places to meet up with each other. Moving entire army regiments is something of a more complex exercise. And so, with that very close cooperation and the understanding that, to be perfectly honest, if one went to war, the other was almost certainly going to war as well, and so much cross-training, it was very easy for them to cooperate. And there is obviously the naval tradition that in a mixed force, it's usually the most senior officer present who takes command. That's why, for example, Admiral Dorman's in charge at the Battle of the Java Sea, although the Dutch Navy is overall very much the smallest of the navies compared to the Royal Navy, US Navy and Australian Navy. He's the most senior officer on the ground. So in any given detachment, given that you don't always have like full-on admirals commanding small squadrons or cruiser patrols or whatever that are sent out, the level of seniority that you need to actually be in command of a group is much less. I mean, you think about HMS Sydney's sweeps through the Mediterranean when she's leading a bunch of British destroyers. The captain is the most senior officer present, therefore he is in command. And because they'd done all this cross-training, the Royal Navy and Australian Navy were pretty much fine with it. They knew that they both knew that the other navy was just as professional, just as skilled as them. Various competitions to see who could be the most aggressive, obviously. And with the interchangeability of equipment, it was pretty easy to just chop and change between various commanders. And also, as said, the fact that a lot of these detachments would have been relatively small. So in an army situation, you might have a local situation where maybe there's an Australian battalion and a couple of random squads of British troops show up, and, well, then the guy in charge of the Australian battalion's in charge because he's by far the senior. But in overall, that would be a very local situation, because as soon as they get back in contact with HQ, they're going to be taking orders from much higher up the food chain, which almost certainly is going to involve a British officer. Whereas when you're out at sea, in the Mediterranean, if Admiral Cunningham sends out, as I said, HMS Sydney's patrol squadron, or if they're in the Pacific and something like Canberra is leading, or even if it's something like the Scrap Iron Flotilla, where you have a flotilla commander with a couple of attached British destroyers, those units will be operating for days, possibly weeks on end, with only relatively tangential connections to anything higher up the food chain. And so, yeah, whoever's the senior most officer on site is in command for a long period of time. And that could be an Australian officer, it could be a British officer. it could change as ships were detached and attached to the formation. So yeah, very, very interchangeable between the two navies, and also Royal New Zealand Navy, Royal Canadian Navy. It was pretty much, well, they might fly a slightly different flag and they might speak with a slightly different accent, but they're all much of a muchness. We'll all follow their orders quite happily. Veenve asks, did British warship designers take future-proofing in the modern sense into consideration before the First World War? Or was it taken for granted that you would be able to compromise on 8 and just build more and newer ships the next year? If they did consider it, what did they expect from their future, and what did they get right? There was a certain degree of future-proofing, I mean, in a way. It depends on whereabouts in the naval arms race you're looking. Initially, the idea was, well, we've built Dreadnought, so we're better than everybody else. Therefore, we have future-proofed our Navy because we win. Then everyone else started building Dreadnoughts, and the Royal Navy had to go, right, okay, we have to build a few more then. This is why the Bellerophons and the St. Vincents, with minor modifications, are effectively repeats of Dreadnought. Now, once you got beyond that into this sort of slightly murky bit when you are running into things like Colossus, Neptune, and Hercules, there's not so much of the future proofing, because at that point the Royal Navy's looking around, seeing what everybody else is building, and going, right, so it's going to be like the early 1900s again, is it? Because remember, back at the beginning of the 1900s, everybody knew that a pre-dreadnought battleship was basically 4 12-inch guns, maybe 11-inch in the Germans' case, with something approximating a 5 or 6-inch secondary battery and the various tertiaries underneath that, unless, of course, you're France. Or the Americans with their weird, our turret must have a hat thing. But in the early part of the 1900s, they'd very rapidly watch that the secondary batteries of battleships climb to the point that 7.5 inch, 8.1 inch, 8 inch, 9.2 inch, 10 inch, even short barrel 12-inch guns on the secondaries. So the capability of pre-dreadnought battleships had exploded in the probably 3 or 4 years between sort of the start of the Russo-Japanese War and the commissioning of HMS Dreadnought. And the Royal Navy was beginning to understand this was probably going to happen again with the Dreadnought race. So probably the least future-proofed ships were the 12-inch ships, because initially they thought they were future-proofed by simply being bigger and better than everybody else, and then it was a case of, well, everything's going to suddenly develop very quickly, because at the time that Colossus, Neptune, and Hercules were being built, the British knew they were working on the 13.5-inch gun, so they knew those ships were going to be obsolete in firepower terms very quickly, and obviously since ships are generally designed to defend against their own firepower, they'd be obsolete in protection as well. Once you start to see the development of the super dreadnoughts, so the Orions, King George V's, and the Iron Dukes, there's a little bit more thought towards future-proofing. Amongst other things, this is why the secondary battery jumps so quickly, because they're thinking about bigger and nastier destroyers coming in. But also, again, the future-proofing there is based somewhat on firepower, in that they've got the advantage, they've got the jump on everybody else by putting the 13.5-inch into service while everyone else is still building 11 or 12-inch ships. And so it's an iterative refinement on this ship, which is then superior, and as and when people start to catch up with ships like, eventually when the Japanese lay down Fuso, or the Americans somewhat earlier laying down ships like Texas and New York, the idea is kind of, well, by that point we have a lot of them, so even if they're kind of equal, our future-proofing is that we just have more. So, there's that. In terms of thinking really long-term into the future, given that the Royal Navy had, basically since Warrior, had watched generations of warships go from brand new to obsolete in 10 to 15 years if they were lucky, they still weren't thinking much beyond those terms. It's only when you get to the Iron Dukes and maybe the Queen Elizabeths, and perhaps more so with the Splendid Cat battle cruisers, because not too many people are building battle cruisers at that point, that they start to think about, oh, these ships might actually be around and relevant for more than a decade. And so that's why you see this kind of blended concept in the Queen Elizabeth. It's trying to up the game on everybody in terms of both firepower and speed, and on almost everybody in protection. So yeah, the Queen Elizabeth's, Tiger, that kind of thing. At this point, they are thinking these ships might be around for a substantial period of time, and also obviously they're getting more and more expensive. So although there is a certain amount of future-proofing in again, the kind of, well, we'll build this really, really good ship that everyone will have to catch up to, and by the time they've caught up to it, we'll have loads of them, which is why the original plan for the Queen Elizabeth was 6. They tried to persuade Canada to pay for another 3. The Revenge class were going to be 8, etc. But even then, the Queen Elizabeths were kind of the high point of the future-proofing thing. And in part, that was because of the concept. In part, that was also accidental, because although the Revenge class were newer vessels, by the time you got to the interwar modernization period, they did fairly quickly discover that the Queen Elizabeths, although being slightly older concept in some respects, such as armor layout, because they were just bigger and had more engine space, or more engine power, they were much more suited for long-term use. So the fact that the Queen Elizabeths stayed pretty much frontline combatants, give or take, throughout the Second World War, as opposed to, well, almost everybody else's surviving ships. You look at Fusos and Iseis, and to a certain extent most of the standards, bar maybe the Colorados, generally ending up in second line roles. The Queen Elizabeths, mostly to be fair, due to their slightly higher speed, still managed to scrape in on a lot of frontline roles. But that future proofing is, as I say, it's partially down to the concept that was behind them, and partially down to just the happy accident that the concept behind them left them with the space and power to be able to be adapted. So yeah, in terms of what they got right, I would say something like Queen Elizabeth, and weirdly enough, the Renown class. That proved immensely adaptable when you look at what Renown could do in 1943-44 versus what it could do in 1917. But yeah, overall they weren't thinking super long-term future. They definitely weren't thinking that the Queen Elizabeths would be in service in the 1940s. At best, they were probably thinking they'd last to the end of the 1930s. And that would be in secondary roles. But they'd probably think their actual combat effectiveness would have come to an end about the end of the 20s if they were really lucky. And when you look at the trajectory of what was being designed for at the time of the Washington Treaty, they're probably right. But obviously things intervened. And that wraps us up for another Drydock episode. The good news is that the winners for the giveaway for the various milestones the channel reached a little while back have now been selected. So look out for a community post where I will have posted those names. And for those of you who are lucky enough to have won something, please get in contact with me via the channel email, and I will enlighten you as to the list of available prizes. Due to the changes in postage costs from the US to the UK and the UK to the US, I have had to make some revised revisions to what's going on compared to previous giveaways, but hopefully it will actually be for the best. So anyway, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video.